Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Herpes Serology, HSV1 and HSV2 type-specific diagnosis from the public health perspective. I'm Dr. Tiffany McKenzie, and I'm a Scientific Affairs Manager of Infectious Disease, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by Labroots and sponsored by DiaSorin. DiaSorin is a global leader in the field of biotechnologies. For more than 40 years, the company has been developing, producing, and commercializing reagent kits for in vitro diagnostics worldwide. It offers the broadest range of specialty tests available in the immunodiagnostics market and continually invests in research and development, using its own distinctive expertise in the field of immunodiagnostics to deliver a high level of innovation. For more information about DiaSorin, please visit www.diasorin.com. Before we begin, we have just a few important announcements. First of all, this webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button in the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions live as we can. You can enlarge this slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. And finally, if you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window or submit your problem through the green Q&A button in the lower left. This is an educational webinar and thus offers free continuing education credits. After the webinar is over, please click on the CE button located in the bottom left corner of your web page and follow the process to obtain your credits. And finally now, I would like to introduce today's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Steece. Dr. Richard Steece is the Public Health Laboratory Director for the State of Tennessee Department of Health. He comes to us today with over 30 years of experience in public health and is one of the nation's leading public health laboratory experts. He has also worked internationally and provided support for many organizations, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, the Association of Public Health Laboratories, APHL, the American Society for Microbiology, ASM, the Clinical Laboratory Standards Institute, CLSI, and the U.S. Department of the Interior, DOI, for projects sponsored all over the world in Asia, the South Pacific, and the United States territories and Europe. Among his multiple roles driving public health initiatives, Dr. Steece has recently served as the National Chlamydia Laboratory Coordinator for the CDC National Infertility Prevention Project, the IPP, and as Science Advisor to the APHL. Dr. Steece is currently the chair of the STD Subcommittee for the APHL and serves on several other key APHL committees. He is a board-certified diplomat of the American Academy of Microbiology, ASM. I will now turn it over to Dr. Richard Steece for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I really appreciate that. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule today to call in and listen to this presentation. And in particular, I'd like to thank DiaSorin for the opportunity to be spending some time with all of you here this morning or this afternoon, depending upon what region of the country that you're located in. As you can see from the slide, the title of the presentation today is Herpes Serology, HSV1 and HSV2 type-specific diagnosis from the public health perspective. And if we look at the next slide, we can look at the objectives. And for us to really understand the recommendations and all the issues surrounding type-specific serological testings, we need to get on the same page. So we need to talk a little bit about some of the other items related to herpes and herpes screening, things like the epidemiology of herpes infections, a little bit about the transmission, the pathology, and some of the clinical manifestations. We also need to describe the methods available to diagnose HSV-1 and HSV-2 infections and the difference between isolation and identification versus serological assays and their respective role in herpes diagnosis. We're going to talk about the CDC sexually transmitted disease treatment guidelines that were published fairly recently in 2015, and talk about the role and the appropriate use of type-specific serological tests. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit more about the guidelines recommendation as to why herpes type-specific screening should not be used at this time in the general U.S. population. But before we go into that, I wanted to put this slide up here. This was an article that appeared in Cosmopolitan magazine in December 2015. And Cosmopolitan has some fairly good health-related articles, certainly on STDs. They've had some nice information in there in the past. And this particular article is about herpes, and the title of it is, "Are We Too Afraid of Herpes? It's Mostly a Benign Skin Condition That Millions of People Have." And that was the title of the article in Cosmopolitan, and individuals can certainly check that out, I'm sure, probably online, or may have copies of that. But there were several quotes in the article that I thought were rather interesting. And one of the quotes in the article stated that herpes, it's just a skin rash, if you even get the skin rash. And also another quote, "It's ironic that herpes has a stigma when nobody dies of it." Well, I want you to kind of keep these things in mind as we go through the presentation today. And at the very end of the presentation, maybe we can revisit this a little bit to see if maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that, or if maybe there's just a little bit more to the issues of herpes and herpes infections. Let's start out with the epidemiology today. Genital herpes is a chronic, lifelong viral infection. Once you're infected with herpes virus, you're infected for life. Herpes virus just loves to live in the nerve cells, and it can go and hide there and persist for long periods of time before the conditions are right, and it may or may not reoccur, or there may be an activation of the original infection. So once you have it forever. There's two HSV serotypes, HSV-1 and HSV-2. HSV-2 is responsible for the majority of cases of recurrent genital herpes in the United States. And a few years back, we used to say that HSV-2 was below the belt, if you will, or genital infections, and HSV-1 was above the belt, oral and/or herpes labialis type infections. And in many areas of the country, that still holds true. However, in many areas of the country, or in certain populations, you do see some differences. For example, in California, you may see HSV-2, HSV-1 in equal numbers below the belt. And you can see that in other certain populations, MSM populations. So you need to look at your specific area, your specific population, the people that you're testing to determine whether HSV-1 or HSV-T is more prominent above or below the belt. According to CDC, there's approximately 1 million new cases of HSV every year. It's estimated there's at least 50 million individuals in the U.S. that have genital HSV infections, and the majority of persons infected with HSV-2 have not been diagnosed with genital herpes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that throughout the presentation, of the fact that most herpes infections are asymptomatic. In the U.S., approximately 15.5% of adults between the ages of 14 and 49 have specific HSV-2 antibodies. HSV-2 seroprevalence is higher in women and men in all age groups and varies by race and ethnicity. And the big thing to remember is the majority of genital herpes infections are transmitted by persons unaware that they're infected or asymptomatic when transmission occurs. So when I used to get phone calls from individuals that, you know, this SOB gave me herpes and I know he had herpes, or she knew I had that she had herpes, they probably didn't know that they were actually infected. They probably were telling the truth and weren't aware because, again, the majority of the cases are asymptomatic. So we're going to talk about this throughout the presentation. This is a slide from CDC. It kind of reinforces what we just talked about. The seroprevalence in women is higher than men, or white women higher than white men, black women higher than in black men. And also the higher rates that we see in the black population. Again, another example of racial inequities, racial disparities that we see with some of the other STDs in addition to herpes. So transmission, let's look at the transmission. HSV1 and HSV2 can both be transmitted sexually and perinatally. There's really no difference between the transmissibility between the two viruses. The efficiency of sexual transmission is greater from men to women than vice versa. And having genital HSV infections increase an individual's risk of acquiring HIV infection twofold. Herpes is not a particularly hardy virus. It's not a particularly strong virus. It's very susceptible to drying, so it's readily inactivated by drying. Most soaps inactivate herpes viruses. Hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, a variety of different agents can inactivate herpes fairly readily. So fomite transmission is uncommon, but it has been documented. So it does occur, but not very commonly, because it just doesn't last long outside of the human body. The pathology, we already talked about herpes. Once you have herpes, it remains with you for life. It remains latent. It goes back into the nerve cells, and it just lives there, just happy as a clam until the next possibility or the next type of stress causes it to come out. And reactivation, as we know, can be precipitated by multiple unknown and some known factors. We've seen on college campuses, for example, as you get closer to finals week or in the middle of finals, individuals with cold sores, stress can pop that out. So herpes can certainly be reactivated by stressful conditions. Sunlight or bad sunburns, we also see that sometimes triggers reactivation of herpes virus in some individuals. Hormonal changes, monthly changes in women can also trigger that. And there's a variety of other things that we know and things that we don't know that can cause these reactivations of herpes virus. Reactivation may be visible. You may see the lesions, or subclinical viral shedding may occur. Primary infections are generally more prolonged and severe, and that makes sense. The body hasn't seen the virus before. You have no immunological capabilities. You have no pre-existing antibodies, no specific cellular immunity. So when an individual is infected in that first case, that primary infection, antibodies take time to develop. Your cellular immunity takes time to develop and to come into play. So that's why your primary infections are generally more prolonged and severe. Secondary infections are generally shorter, of a shorter duration. And HSV2 may have more recurrent infections than HSV1. Therefore, prognostically, this is important. And that's one of the reasons when we get into the discussion about laboratory tests, we'll talk a little bit about typing this virus. And there's other reasons why we want to type it too. But prognostically is certainly one of those. This is a nice slide from CDC, and it kind of points out what we just kind of talked about. The first episode, if you look over on the left side of the slide, the infection type, first episode, primary infection with type 1 or type 2. At that time, this individual has not had and not been exposed to HSV1 or HSV2. So they have no pre-existing antibodies and no pre-existing specific cellular immunity. In that case, the lesions, the symptoms that are listed here can be severe and certainly prolonged. An example of the first episode in a non-primary case, the next line of type 2, where you have a pre-existing HSV1 infection, it can actually moderate that because there is some cross-protection. And you can look at this chart, and it gives a good example of why this occurs, why when antibodies are present, it can modulate or turn it from a more milder infection than that first primary episode. We talk about the clinical manifestations, and here we see some primary lesions or a case of primary infection with these lesions on the penis. And I want to point these out for a couple of reasons. One, this is not when a lot of individuals think of herpes, and especially individuals that have had that or had cold sores, you know how vesicular it gets. These lesions are getting a little bit old. They're getting a little bit dried up and a little crusty. These are not the ideal lesions that you would want to use for virus isolation. You would want to have fresh, nice vesicular lesions for that. Your success of getting an isolate cell culture or a direct test or PCR for that matter is certainly decreased the longer the infection goes. When the lesions are starting to dry and crust up, that's not the time. Now, if this is an individual that says, well, I get these about every 2-3 months, you can take the specimen, but you also want to tell the individuals, come back the next time early on when these things are vesicular so we can get a good specimen. Because if there's anything about herpes, the fact that it reoccurs is nice for the opportunity to try and get isolates and to confirm that. So these, again, are not the best lesions to actually try and get an isolate from. This is a picture of a recurrent ulcer, clinical notification. Now you can see the recurrent ulcer. It's an ulcer, and again, it doesn't look like a vesicular lesion. It could certainly be confused with something else. There's other things that can cause ulcers, and we're going to talk a little bit about that confusion in just a couple minutes. Cervicitis. We talked about asymptomatic shedding. Here's an individual with a case of cervicitis. That individual may be feeling perfectly normal. No aches, no pains, no fever, no nothing, and may have viral shedding and not be aware of it. So, case of cervicitis, you can see why individuals may transmit this virus and not even be aware that they're infected. This slide is actually a good slide, and it shows two different things. A slide on the buttocks, and it shows nice vesicular lesions. These are the lesions that you want to look for to collect a nice specimen from. If you take and aseptically break that lesion open with a forceps or tweezers or whatever you have in the clinic, and you take that swab, as long as it's not a cotton tip swab, not a wood shaft swab, or a calcium alginate swab, which all can be toxic to herpes, just a rayon or a Dacron swab, and you take and you soak that swab up with the fluid that's in these vesicular lesions and rub the base of those cells. If you're not causing the patient some discomfort, you're most likely not collecting the specimen vigorously enough. So that's one thing that you need to remember. If you should be causing the patient a little bit of discomfort to be collecting that specimen properly. If you take that specimen properly at this stage, put it in a specific viral transport medium and send that to the lab, and there's no huge delays in getting that to the lab, you're going to get herpes virus out of that specimen. Almost all of the tests that we have will probably get a nice, good positive out of a nice, fresh lesion like this. Another thing to note that herpes lesions can occur on any part of the body. There's been cases, especially with younger individuals, of individuals auto-inoculating themselves, scratching and picking away at a cold sore and scratching another area on the body and infecting and transmitting that virus. If there's a broken skin, abrasions, and the virus gets on that particular area through scratching or whatever, it can gain a foothold and it can infect. So you may see these potentially on any area of the body. We used to see an occasional case, generally HSV1, in dentists doing dental work and nick or a cut in the knuckle area in particular, and develop a herpes whitlow. Don't see that as much as we used to see that because people were a little bit more cognizant of that and a little bit more careful with drugs and HIV and other types of infections now. So we don't see that as common as we used to, but it can occur in any part of the body. And the dead giveaway are these vesicular lesions. They're very characteristic. If you see something like this, especially if the patient comes in and says, yeah, I get these every month, or I've had this 3 or 4 times now over the last year. It's pretty much a dead giveaway. There's not much else that looks like this that's going to reoccur. Not much. So HSV diagnosis, the clinical diagnosis itself, can be insensitive. Individual may be asymptomatic, as we saw from one of the previous slides, the case of cervicitis. Individual was certainly having an episode and may not have even known it at the time. So the clinician certainly is not going to see that unless they're doing a routine pelvic exam, and the individual's not going to know that they're shedding. So they can be relatively insensitive when you're just looking and trying to find lesions, and certainly nonspecific when you see old lesions or one old lesion or an ulcer that we saw earlier. That ulcer certainly could be confused with something else, or even something not related to an infectious agent. So clinical diagnosis itself often needs help. The key, of course, you see these recurrence, these vesicular lesions, pretty diagnostic in most cases. So therefore, clinical diagnosis should always be confirmed by laboratory testing using specific virology tests, culture or non-culture or serological test, some sort of test to confirm that. And the reason, other than oftentimes a clinician may or may not be sure when they look at a lesion, the second reason is psychologically. I've seen many instances where an individual is clinically diagnosed with HSV infection, but there's something about taking a specimen and sending it to the lab, getting that lab result back, and that clinician actually holding, you have laboratory diagnosed herpes, herpes 1, herpes 2, whatever, and then going into the counseling message, here's what you need to do, here's how you need to adjust your lifestyle, etc. Oftentimes, individuals seem to pay more attention to that than just a clinician saying, oh yeah, it looks like a herpes virus, and may or may not accompany that with some specific counseling. So for those 2 reasons, I think it's extremely important that you confirm this with specific laboratory tests. Let's look at some of those laboratory tests. We have a viral culture, which has long been considered the gold standard. And we also see, if you look at the bottom, you can see PCR, which is the gold standard. So are we just confused? Well, we're not confused, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through these. But viral culture has long been considered the gold standard, and it is a good test, and is somewhat the preferred test for patients with fresh genital ulcers or other fresh lesions. And it's still necessary to determine antiviral resistance. At this point in time, we don't know the specific sequences, so we don't know, we don't have techniques to molecularly determine the antiviral resistant patterns in herpes virus. Yeah, it's just a matter of time as we move into the more into the molecular area and the sequencing area that we probably will have. But at this point in time, we still need a culture to look at antiviral resistance. Antigen detection or direct detection from lesions with DFA or possible some of the EIAs. CDC suggests they may be slightly better than culture for detecting HSV in healing lesions. And of course, that assumes that you're taking that scab or crust off, and you're really scraping and causing some discomfort to obtain that specimen. I haven't seen any data to really strongly support this, but CDC suggests that it may be. So we'll look at that. Cytology, a zinc smear or PrEP smear, they're insensitive and non-specific. PAP test was not developed to diagnose herpes infections. Now, not that you cannot occasionally see a herpes infection there, but it shouldn't be used specifically for HSV diagnosis. PCR really has been replacing viral culture for quite a long time as the method of choice for HSV. It's extremely sensitive, and we're going to talk about the relative sensitivities and specificities again in a few minutes. It's certainly the preferred test for detecting HSV in spinal fluid or with neonatal samples, other CNS type specimens. If we look at cell culture, there's still conventional culture. There are sites that are still doing conventional cell culture. They use a variety of different cells because they're looking for a lot of viruses, not just herpes viruses. And there are systems that utilize shell vials that look for several different viruses, but also look specifically for just herpes virus, something like the enzyme-linked viral inducible multi-well system, or the ELVIS system from Diagnostic Hybrids. But the one thing that you want to remember, and the CDC recommends, is that you confirm and type with DFA. When you see cells on the left part of the slide, nice fibroblast cells, uninfected, and slides and cells in the middle, you can see the rounded cells. You can see some giant cells. You can look at it, and you can almost tell by the type of cells and the CPE that it's herpes virus. And in many cases, you can almost type by looking herpes 1 or herpes 2. But you should confirm, obviously, with DFA because you can't do that 100% of the time. So a nice DFA to confirm that, because remember, prognostically, you're going to see more recurrences with 2 than 1. And in addition, the information for your population that we talked about a few minutes ago. 50% of the cases are below the belt with HSV1 and HSV2 in your particular region. The reason we know that is because we type those. So we know that epidemiological information. So it's important for a couple of reasons to type these and to differentiate herpes 1 and herpes 2. And that's currently the CDC recommendations also. So some of the advantages of cell culture, it does require live virus. So you do need to get these at a fairly early stage, nice vesicular lesions, take them properly, that we talked about a few minutes ago, to get those infected cells. And you need special virus transport medium, transported under the right conditions. It works very well. It can be used for lesions at all locations, penile, labial, oral, buttocks, wherever you might find these lesions. It has a high specificity. When you see the specific CPE growing in fibroblast cells, it's pretty difficult to mistake herpes CPE from other types of viruses that you might isolate in those cells. There are a few exceptions, but generally it's pretty difficult not to be able to identify that by the way the cells grow in your cell culture and your specific CPE. It can also be used to differentiate HSV1 and HSV2, and we talked about why that's important, and the antiviral susceptibility testing, and we talked about why that is important also. Some of the disadvantages, well, it's comparatively expensive, certainly more expensive than some of the non-culture techniques. There's many variables involved: the cells themselves, the medium, the transport condition. Technically, it's a little more difficult than the non-culture tests. Not useful with asymptomatic patients. You don't want to routinely just take cervical or urethral or swab type specimens when you see no lesions. So individuals that are asymptomatically shedding or potentially asymptomatically shedding, probably not the test of choice for that. There's somewhat of a delayed turnaround time also, 1 to 3 days. The virus has to grow. However, if you take a good, fresh specimen, transported in the right conditions to the lab with the right transport medium, etc., you're probably going to see that virus in 24 hours. Herpes likes to grow in most cells. Actually, it grows in most cells. There's not too many cells that it doesn't grow in, but it does grow very well, and it grows very fast. Certainly by 3 days, you're going to detect probably 95 to 99% of the herpes infections in cell culture. Now, occasionally, I've detected positives out in 5 to 6 to 7 days, but that's been very rare, and probably it came from specimens that were older lesions, etc. But a fresh specimen, usually the virus is chewed through your cells by the next day. Very quick growing. The sensitivity can be low, again, as the lesions begin to heal. And you can get false negative results in those situations. Okay, let's look at some of the non-culture tests. Well, we already talked about the direct smears and stains, the zinc smear or zinc stain, DFA, immunoperoxidase, and some of the enzyme immunoassays. If we look at some of the advantages, they are relatively inexpensive and they're fairly rapid, but they're very insensitive. So they certainly shouldn't be used in critical situations, not with newborns or pregnant women at term, or suspected encephalitis or CSF or any of the critical type specimens. And the stains, it's a non-specific stain. And they also require lesions. So there's several disadvantages of these tests, and they're not recommended really at this point in time. The nucleic acid amplified test, excellent test. One of the first ones that was developed, PCR, using the Roche light cycler, Mayo Clinic, Dr. Tom Smith and colleagues at Mayo kind of developed this early protocol, at least one of the major sites that were using this protocol. They had many workshops back several years ago at the American Society for Microbiology annual meetings, the Clinical Virology Symposium, and really tried to transfer this technology out into the virus labs. I remember attending a couple of workshops with Dr. Smith and some of the crew from Mayo. The little light cycler worked very well, and you could also type at the time. They used a little melting curve, and you could type and isolate with increased sensitivity and specificity. It was a great little procedure. And there's procedures to still use the light cycler and/or other machines and amplification methods, the Luminex, the Molecold RTX, the BioHelix, the little self-contained little plastic apparatus that contains everything in the little cartridge, and the BD ProTech, the Herpes simplex virus due to the X. Excellent amplified tests and techniques for detecting HSV infections. The advantages, like I mentioned before, they're the most sensitive tests. They provide rapid turnaround time, meaning same-day results, and in most cases, a half day. They can be used to differentiate HSV1 from HSV2, and it's definitely the test of choice for looking for herpes in spinal fluid or infections in the central nervous system, etc. A place where you're more than likely not going to find either viable virus or not a lot of virus present. It's definitely recommended for those types of specimens. And it has high specificity, 99% or greater. Some of the disadvantages, depending on the version, it might not be suitable for large volume screening if you're doing lots of herpes virus culturing. It does require a high technical skill, although with the newer nucleic acid amplified tests, we're getting to the point where cell culture probably requires a higher degree of technical skill than the nucleic acid amplified test in most cases. Special facilities or a clean area, well, no longer really special facilities, but you do need to keep kind of a clean area. They're getting more and more forgiving with, again, cartridges where everything's self-contained, and much more able to run these on the regular lab bench. But you still, ideally, would want to keep those in a nice, clean area anytime you're trying to do amplified testing. They're fairly expensive, certainly one of the big drawbacks, and not all the nets that are available are FDA cleared. Okay, let's start talking about some of the serological assays. There are a variety of different tests that are available. HSV2 rapid tests, the Fisher SureView HSV2. I think it was the old test from Pathology that now Fisher either bought or Fisher is either selling for them or somebody bought them out. I only see the Fisher name on it nowadays. And the Herpes Select Express HSV2 from Focus. And also the chemoluminescent assay, the liaison, the Asorum, HSV1 and HSV2 type-specific tests. And we're going to talk about the difference between type-specific here in a minute and why that's critical. Enzyme immunoassays, Herpes Select 1 and 2 from Focus, HSV 1 and 2 from Trinity, and there's other manufacturers that do have some herpes tests. Western blot, I'm not aware of any commercial Western blot kit. There may be, I'm not aware of any. When most Western blot is needed, I know some of the private labs, some private labs are doing it. University of Washington probably is a leader in that. It's a very difficult test to standardize and to read, so The people at the University of Washington have a lot of experience in doing Western blot. So if you need to have a Western blot for some reason, you might want to consider that. They're very good at what they do. There's also the Herpes Select 1 and 2 immunoblot from Focus. The only problem with that is right now CDC doesn't recommend that because it uses the same recombinant antigens as they use in their enzyme immunoassay tests. However, one thing to remember is when you do a screening assay, even if you're using something that has the same recombinant antigen, a simple repeat does increase your positive predictive value. That's one of the reasons that we do that with HIV. When we do our repeat testing, it increases our positive predictive value. That's just something to keep in mind. But currently, it's not recommended in the treatment guidelines. Serology, the advantages of serology. If the test is designed like the DS1 and some of the other assays to detect glycoprotein 1, G1, and G2, you can differentiate between HSV1 and HSV2 infections. We used to do a lot of serologies for herpes virus before glycoprotein 1 and glycoprotein 2 were even identified. And we could detect antibodies, but we couldn't differentiate. We couldn't tell whether it was 1 or whether it was 2, whether those lesions that you saw, genital lesions that you saw, and you picked up a positive serology result, whether that really came from a herpes 1 infection from the lips, or whether it really was related to HSV2. So without using a specific test that can differentiate those two specific antigens, HSV serology is currently not recommended. So the tests that are available, the sensitivity does vary a bit, between 80 to 90%. The specificity is in the high 90s. And you get rapid turnaround time, again, meaning same-day result for these tests. They're very good assays for doing what they're designed to do. They're moderately expensive. They're technically less than culture tests and other antigen tests, and they may not distinguish glycoprotein G1 and G2 depending on the version. So you need to make sure that if you're requesting a serological assay as a clinician, that that test can differentiate between those, if that's what you're asking that test to do. I'm not sure why you would want to know just whether they have HSV antibodies or not. It probably would provide very little clinical information to you. So make sure that whatever site you're using does utilize something that can differentiate and type HSV1 and HSV2 serologically. So where do we use the type-specific serological tests according to the CDC and public health recommendations? Cases where recurrent genital symptoms or atypical symptoms with negative HSV PCR or culture occur. To confirm clinical diagnosis without laboratory confirmation. To manage sex partners of persons with genital herpes, especially in discordant couples, individuals where the wife or perhaps the husband is infected and the wife or the opposite partner is not. To manage those, especially in cases where they're thinking about having children. The wife becoming pregnant if she's negative, seronegative, and the husband seropositive, for examples. So to manage those types of partners, to provide education, to eliminate some of the risk factors that might be associated with transmission from a positive partner to a negative, to a current negative partner. CDC also suggests that type-specific serological tests should be considered for persons presenting for an STD evaluation, especially individuals with multiple partners. An individual that's having multiple partners engaging in high-risk activities, they haven't been evaluated before for STDs. This would be a good example of an individual that should be evaluated. Individuals that are infected with HIV, MSM, or men who have sex with men, are at an increased risk for HIV infection if they participate in high-risk activities. Those individuals should also be screened or suggested that they be screened for type-specific assays. However, you can see why screening in the general population is currently not indicated because of the amount of people that are shedders, asymptomatic shedders, and the amount of people that have HSV1 and HSV2 at different locations. So screening in the general population at this time is probably not useful and certainly not recommended by CDC at this point in time. IgM antibodies. Well, IgM antibodies can be detected, and they can be detected in primary HSV infections, if you know it's a primary infection. Unfortunately, that would be very common to be able to know that for sure. Co-infection with another HSV type, HSV1, in seropositive individuals that are acquiring HSV2. Dual infections. IgM can also be produced. IgM can be produced in reactivated HSV infections. So therefore, IgM antibodies are not a reliable indicator of primary HSV infections. And it's generally not recommended at this time to screen using an IgM antibody assay. Most of the information, or much of the information that we talked about this afternoon, actually comes out of the CDC STD treatment guidelines that you see below under the chapter or the part of the guidelines that talk about the principles of management of genital herpes. And we're going to talk about some of those again. I mention this because these recommendations are available online. You can go online at the cdc.gov website. You can download these. You can actually order these from CDC. And they have some nice wall charts also that you can order. So there's some other materials that you can get from CDC to look at specific recommendations for all STDs, but certainly for the recommendations for genital herpes. And if you want more details over some of the things that we've gone over this afternoon, the guidelines are going to provide a lot more detail than we're going over this afternoon. So patient management. Well, what do we do for the patient? Well, counseling is critical. Counseling regarding the natural history, sexual and perinatal transmission, methods to reduce transmission are extremely important. The individual needs to be talked to about lifestyle changes, defining the responsibilities that they have to their sexual partners. Extremely important that individuals communicate back and forth with one another. That individuals are aware of some of the how they can lower some of the risk of transmission through the use of condoms, for example. So there's a lot of information, and that's available again on the CDC website. But that counseling should be an integral part of patient management. Antiviral therapy. Well, what does antiviral therapy or chemotherapy fit? Well, it can control or partially control the signs and symptoms of herpes. A couple things to remember. It does not eradicate latent virus. While it may cause the virus to have a shortened course of infection, and it may keep the virus from recurring quite as many times, it does not eliminate the virus. Once you've had the virus, you will continue to have that virus. It will not eliminate that virus from the body. Also, it does not affect the risk, the frequency, or severity of recurrences after the drug is discontinued. When the drug is discontinued, herpes can reactivate at any point in time, and it can certainly even when they're on suppressive therapy, but maybe just for a lesser time period. But when that drug's taken away, you go back basically to first base or step one. Antiviral medications. We have some excellent antiviral chemotherapies available to us. Acyclovir is generally the first chemotherapy, antiviral chemotherapy of choice. Valacyclovir and famciclovir. Generally, topical therapy with antiviral drugs is generally not recommended in most cases. CDC recommended regimen for a first clinical episode. The antiviral chemotherapeutic choice is acyclovir, either in 400 or 200 milligrams, either 3 or 5 times a day for 7 to 10 days, followed by valacyclovir and famciclovir in the case of the first clinical episode, depending upon the severity of that. And again, for more specific information, consult the guidelines. Antiviral therapy can be considered for suppressive therapy for recurrent genital herpes. It can also be considered for episodic therapy for recurrent genital herpes and treatment of severe diseases. in the case of really severe disseminated herpes virus. And those recommendations are all in the guidelines. Genital herpes during pregnancy. Most mothers of infants who acquire neonatal herpes lack histories of clinically evident genital herpes. Again, most individuals are asymptomatic. They're infected and don't know they're infected. The risk for the transmission to the neonate is high, 30 to 50% among women who acquire genital herpes near the time of delivery or at the time of delivery. Individuals, neonates that are born from an infected mother that do acquire a herpes infection have a high probability of high mortality and morbidity. So herpes is associated with mortality. It's also associated with mortality in individuals in the case of herpes encephalitis. Not real common, but it does happen. In women with histories of recurrent herpes or acquired genital herpes during the first half of pregnancy or before, the risk is fairly low for transmitting that to the neonate. Prevention of neonatal herpes then depends on avoiding acquisition during late pregnancy, avoiding exposure of the infant to lesions during delivery if they are present. So all pregnant women should certainly be asked whether they have a history of genital herpes. Not only ask, but ask specific questions about if they ever experienced lesions, genital lesions here, etc. So a very thorough history should be taken. And again, there's more recommendations in the guidelines on how to handle and how to avoid and how to treat neonates that are infected with herpes. So, in conclusion, is herpes just a benign skin condition or something that we should take serious? Well, we talked about a lot of serious things here today, and so I think you have to answer that question yourself. The next one, should individuals infected with herpes get a big H on their forehead? Well, of course not. There shouldn't be a stigma because there's so many people that are infected with herpes viruses. It's not the end of the world. Individuals do need to receive the correct counseling and messages. Is it true that nobody dies from herpes infections? Well, that's not true. We do know that individuals do die from herpes infections, in particular, infants that are infected during the birth process from an infected mother. So it is a big deal. So it is true that through appropriate testing, proper education, patient management, and counseling, individuals should be able to lead a healthy, normal life without guilt. So we answered all the questions that were brought up by Cosmo. Well, I'm not sure, but I guess we can take a look at that ourselves. And at this point, I'd like to end the presentation. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer those. And thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you, Dr. Steece, for that brilliant presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button in the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions live as we can. And our first question for Dr. Steece is, could you please go over, Dr. Steece, if a woman has an outbreak of HSV at delivery, what are the recommendations?
Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Remember from the presentation, CDC reminds us that all pregnant women should be asked whether they have a history of genital herpes and examined carefully, especially at the onset of labor. And women without symptoms or signs of genital herpes or its prodrome can deliver vaginally, although C-section does not completely eliminate the risk for HSV transmission to the neonate. Women with recurrent genital herpes lesions at the onset of labor should deliver by C-section to reduce the risk of the neonatal HSV infection from occurring. And that's right out of the CDC guidelines. So there's a little bit more information in there if you want to follow up and read up on that a little bit. But I think that probably answers the question for you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that, Dr. Steece. Next question, a really quick definition question. You referred to on the transmission slide, slide 8, to fomite. Can you define what fomite transmission is?
Sure. Fomites are generally inanimate objects that are capable of transmitting infections to humans. Things like doorknobs, toys, or in the case of HSV, maybe sexual toys, etc. So any inanimate object that somebody would cough on or contaminate somehow that could transmit an illness or a disease to a human.
Okay, great. Next question here. The person writing in asked, my understanding of difference between HSV-1 and 2 is that if you get HSV-1 below the belt, it is only a one-time infection or outbreak, whereas HSV-2 in the oral area is only a one-time infection or outbreak. Is this true?
Not entirely. HSV-2 certainly has more recurrence, and prognostically, the chances of it recurring more frequently or at regular intervals is certainly more common than HSV-1. And an individual that's infected below the belt, if you will, with HSV-1, they may see a single outbreak, but generally they'll see a recurrence, but rather than 5 to 6 perhaps a year, or 5 to even a dozen a year, it may be 1 or 2. Certainly reduced occurrence if they do occur. So they do occur, not as common, but they do, and generally less frequency if they do reoccur.
That's a really interesting, informative response. Thank you. So next question, is it easy to do molecular or polymerase chain reaction testing of HSV-1 or HSV-2 in the blood?
Well, as far as the ease of doing PCR, of course, PCR is PCR. I mean, it's pretty easy to do on blood or any other types of specimens. I think that the question you're probably asking is it a good specimen to, is blood a good specimen to test for HSV-1 or HSV-2 by nucleic acid amplification? And there's not a lot of data because we don't routinely test that. It's more like spinals or infants and secretions and body tissues and etc. Generally, with most viruses, there's a very short viremic stage, if there even is one. So I would say, it would not be a specimen of choice. Could it ever be detected in blood? Well, certainly in cases of infant disseminated conditions, etc. But I think it would be very poor choice to consider using under routine circumstances.
All right, thank you for your input on utility of molecular testing and different sample types. This next question is an excellent point. What clinical advantage is there to knowing if a patient has HSV-1 versus HSV-2?
Well, again, kind of what we said in the presentation, prognostically, HSV-1 generally below the belt tends to recur less frequently and certainly less severe in most cases than HSV-2. So prognostically is probably the biggest reason, and of course we did mention the kind of the epidemiology reasons of being able to differentiate, so you could kind of know in your population what you were seeing. So probably the prognostic difference would be the major reason to know whether it's HSV-1 or 2.
Excellent. So going back to more of a public health question, how effective are condoms in preventing the spread of HSV? I know you touched on it, but do you mind going over that again?
Sure. That's actually a really good question. Basically, CDC says and has the data to support that condoms, when they're used consistently and correctly, they can reduce but not eliminate the risk for genital herpes transmission. Because we have to remember, most cases of herpes are transmitted by persons unaware that they're infected or are asymptomatic. So individuals most likely would not be using condoms in those cases anyway. In addition, since lesions can appear in different areas of the body, the condom's only going to be able to protect what it covers. So they can be very effective depending upon where the lesions are and how they're used, but they will not eliminate the risk completely.
Excellent. Thank you for making that point. Next question about serology. This is an excellent point about indications. Do you consider serologic assays, do you consider them that they should be recommended to test pediatric or immunocompromised patients?
And I think what I would say is I would refer you to the guidelines on that, and the guidelines do recommend, in immunocompromised, especially individuals with history. So there's a lot of combination information that you would look for as to whether you'd want to make that decision. And so I suggest, you kind of look into the guidelines, for more specifics on that. And of course, any of these should be discussed with the individual clinicians, the patient's clinicians too. So I would refer you back to the guidelines for more specifics on where they actually do recommend that these be tested.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for referring us back to the guidelines. Another interesting question about HSV types. So are there more types of HSV, for example, 3, 4, and so on? We spoke about HSV 1 and 2 type-specific tests today, but can you speak about other serology types?
Sure. Well, if you remember back when we first started identifying herpes viruses, herpes 1, herpes 2 were a couple of the first viruses that we identified, varicella zoster, chickenpox, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr. They're all in the herpes virus groups. And as we discovered new ones, we started numbering those. So we do now the newer nomenclature is actually, to refer those as by their serotype. And they all cause a variety of different things, as you know, and there are specific tests, both isolation, nucleic acid amplification tests, and serologies for the other ones like chickenpox and cytomegalovirus, etc. So there are multiple herpes viruses, and now you may see them referred to as human herpes virus 3 or human herpes virus 4 or 5, but that just relates back to in most cases, to the ones that we've already known existed, and a couple of the new ones that we've discovered that were caused by herpes viruses. So it's just kind of a different nomenclature for some of the viruses that we've already named.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time for just one more question. I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I have one more really excellent serology question here. So Dr. Steece, you indicated that serology tests having sensitivity within 80 to 90%. Currently, FDA is asking for at least 95% sensitivity in comparison against Western blots or immunoblots in 510K submissions. Could you please comment on this?
Well, I think when you look at the serological assays that have been submitted in the past, oftentimes FDA's criteria, is changed over time. And when a test gets FDA cleared, I find it's very uncommon for FDA, when they do come out with changes or more restrictions, to go back and decertify or unclear a specific test. So there have been tests, and there's a lot of tests that are FDA cleared and been through the process. There's tests that are not specific for HSV1 and HSV2 that are FDA cleared. So I think it's probably good that FDA continues to look at this and trying to raise the standards and to provide reasonable guidance to sites, but it certainly doesn't prevent older tests that have been FDA cleared with less sensitivity and specificity to still be available or on the market, if you will. So I guess, long story, it's a good thing that FDA is constantly doing this and evaluating it, and it just makes those tests perform even better with the input that they get from the old tests and from individuals that are doing these. So I think it's a good deal that they do look at these and occasionally change their standards, but it still doesn't get rid of a lot of the tests that were already cleared out there.
That's an excellent answer, Dr. Steece. Thank you so much for speaking to the increasing standards of the FDA and how we manage those tests that are currently cleared and raising the standards for the next generation. So if there are no more questions, I know there are a number of questions actually that we didn't get to, and they're excellent, and we will address those. Dr. Steece and I will address those as quickly as possible following this webinar. But if they're to be mindful of time, we're going to wrap this up, but I just want to once again thank Dr. Richard Steece for his excellent presentation, and I just want to double check with you, Dr. Steece, do you have any other final comments you'd like to make before we wrap this up today?
No, other than if anybody has any follow-up questions, please, address them, in a proper way back to the website, either to Tiffany or myself, and we'll certainly be glad to answer those for you.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Steece, and I'd also like to thank our sponsor, DiaSorin, for making today's educational webcast possible. And just as a reminder, today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through September 17th, 2016. You will receive an email from Labroots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay, and we invite you to forward this on to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It was really our pleasure, and have a great day.